Okay, welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm
Brenda, I'm glad to be here.
thank you. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their lives, their crafts, and their work. And the voice you just heard saying thank you, Brenda, is Lawrence Hill. I'm very happy to have Lawrence on the air with us today. He is calling in from Toronto, Canada. And Lawrence Hill is the author of Someone Knows My Name. We'll be talking about this book, his process, and his research on the book, and talking about some of the themes in this very, very compelling, difficult book. So, again, welcome once again, Lawrence.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I just want to just share Lawrence Hill is the author of four novels. Someone Knows My Name, I believe, is his fourth novel, and you can add on to this, Lawrence, as we talk. He's also the author of Any Known Blood, Some Great Thing, and The Deserter's Tale. And as I said, he resides in Canada, and he has been promoting this book. This is a book which I had difficulty putting down, although it took me some time to read it because sometimes I had to just stop and reflect and think. It was so compelling.
That's good to hear. I guess you always want to feel that, don't you? That on one hand, it's exciting to know that a reader is losing herself in your book, and on the other hand, it's also gratifying to know that they're stopping to think as they go along.
Yes. Well, Publishers Weekly says that this book brings to life a crucial chapter in world history. It spans 6 decades and 3 continents. They also describe it as stunning, wrenching, and inspiring. And I think it is that way because basically this is what we call historical fiction. And historical fiction, as we know, brings to life the history, the stories, the he stories and she stories of our lives. So why don't we begin, Lawrence, by having you give a little bit more information about yourself and how you came to write Someone Knows My Name.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
I'm the product of really an American and a Canadian family. My parents were Americans who married in Washington, D.C. in 1953 and then moved to Canada to raise a family and to continue their lives north of the border. And so the family connection is really, for me, has always spanned both countries. And I'm interested in the history of African Americans and African Canadians on the continent of North America, but also as they've moved to and from North America, and there are many migrations over the centuries. Someone Knows My Name is the story of an African woman's life. It's told in her voice. She's an old woman when she begins to tell the story. Her name is Aminata Diallo. And when she's a young girl of 11, just really on the edge of womanhood, she's abducted as a child and brought into slavery into the Americas. She's brought into work in an indigo plantation in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and eventually manages to find a way home, hoping at least to go home, manages to return to Africa, stunning migration back and forth across the ocean, which did actually occur to a few people in the same lifetime in the 18th century. So this is a story of her journeys back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, initially as a child slave and later in life as a free African woman hoping to return home.
Right. That's an unusual story. That's the story we don't hear, the migrations that went back and forth. And of course, what was also fascinating was the immigration or the migration of the blacks to Nova Scotia, something else we don't know about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, really there are 3 sort of major historical planks that prop up this novel and support it, and really on which the story rests, on which the imagined novel rests. And in chronological order, I guess the first is that during the American Revolutionary War, although some African Americans fought for the rebels, fought for those who became the Americans, and indeed the first to die in the Revolutionary War was a black man serving the rebels by the name of Crispus Attucks. Many African Americans also served the British. The British promised them freedom and security in exchange for service, and so thousands did as the British suggested in print, fled their plantations, profited from the chaos of the Revolutionary War, ran behind British lines, and served the British by the thousands, men and women, especially in Manhattan, which was the last bastion of British control during the war. When the war ended, the British evacuated 3,000 African Americans who'd served them during the war. After registering them in a British military ledger known as the Book of Negroes, they carted them off by the thousands to Nova Scotia, Canada. They spent 10 difficult years in Nova Scotia, where they faced tremendous oppression and racism and slavery and indentured servitude. And finally, they were so unhappy with the broken promises of their lives in Canada that they turned around and accepted an offer from the British government, a voluntary offer to sail to Sierra Leone in 1792. And they became the first African Americans and the first African peoples in the Americas to sail in any sort of mass migration from the Americas to Africa. And this is in 1792 from Halifax to Freetown. So my character is involved in all of these movements, drawn into the Americas as a child slave, traveling up to Manhattan to serve the British, over to Nova Scotia with the people who are known as the Black Loyalists, those who served the British during the war, and then back to Africa, all in the same lifetime.
Right, and that is amazing. You have some other historical figures that come up in the book. You have Francis Tavern?
Yes, the Francis Tavern, which is located in sort of in the southern tip of Manhattan, figures prominently in the novel, as does a fictionalized character whose name is Sam Francis, who in the novel is a black West Indian man who's free, who owns the Francis Tavern. There's some debate about this man's racial identity, but in the novel I've firmly established him as black, and he owns the Francis Tavern. It's a very well-known tavern. It's where Washington celebrated his victory when he came into New York City at the end of the Revolutionary War, celebrating his victory with his officers. So Francis provides shelter and support to Aminata and some of the other black loyalists who are huddled in poverty in Manhattan during the war.
Right. Another element that plays very strongly in the book is the whole literacy, the notion of literacy, because Amanita, of course, learns to read and write, and she also ends up doing this for a number of blacks who were free, and as well as some of those, I believe, who were enslaved.
Yes, well, this literacy issue fascinates me. Although, of course, it was illegal for African American peoples who were enslaved to learn to read and write, and it was also illegal to teach a slave to read and write. We know that many African Americans learned to read and write anyway, and we know this, of course, because we have the memoirs that they left behind, that they wrote with their own hands and left behind. And there are many memoirs existing even from the 18th century. And so we know that a few did go on to read and write and write their life stories. Aminata really wants to become literate from her earliest childhood in the country in which she's born, which is now known as Mali, a landlocked country in West Africa. Her father can read a little bit of Arabic and is Muslim and is studying the Quran in her home regularly, and so she wants to learn to read from her childhood. And so this seed of literacy, the desire to be literate, is planted in her from her childhood in Africa. And also she's impressed by the whole quality of the jellies, or the griots who tell family stories and village stories and recount the lives of the people in the villages in which they live as they're living, and are very celebrated for doing so. So she does learn to read and write in South Carolina, when she's brought to the Sea Islands to work on a plantation, an indigo plantation, and she uses this acquired literacy to advance her knowledge of the world and to try to help her get back to Africa. But she also uses it to help out people around her who are clamoring, other African Americans who are clamoring to learn to read and write themselves, and so she takes every opportunity she can to teach them.
Right, and I think this is one of the things that really was very compelling about the novel, is that you really provide so many strong details. You really get a very vivid picture of what it was like to be first enslaved and then to gain your freedom. The way you described the indigo making process of making indigo was just really, really very, very detailed. It got a really strong portrait of that, and the way you describe the whole process of the Middle Passage, that was very, very detailed. So
Thank you. Well, I guess one of the challenges in writing fiction, is especially historical fiction, is to bring out the individual quality of people's lives, to show those lives in their full color, and not to make history a simple, boring recitation of facts, but to color in lives and to show how people were living and working and sleeping and eating and what they were wearing, and to make their personal stories unforgettable, and therefore to sort of bring history back to life. History doesn't have to be boring. It becomes exciting, I think, when human life and human struggle is injected back into it. And so the story of the Middle Passage and the story of African Americans working on indigo plantations in the middle and latter part of the 18th century in the Sea Islands of South Carolina is fascinating to me, and I strove to bring them to life, on the page of this novel.
Thank you. This is probably a good time to get a snapshot or portrait of the novel. Do you want to?
I'd be happy to. I'm just going to read a very brief, a couple paragraphs from the opening chapter of the novel being called Someone Knows My Name, and the chapter being called And Now I Am Old. And in this chapter, Aminata is a very old woman, an African woman who finds herself in London, England, near the end of her life. She's gone to help the abolitionists bring about the abolition of the British slave trade. And while doing so, she begins the process of writing her own life story, which becomes really the stuff of this novel. And so here I'll read just a little bit from her voice in the chapter setting out the novel.
Thank you.
Let me begin with a caveat to any and all who find these pages. Do not trust large bodies of water, and do not cross them. If you, dear reader, have an African hue and find yourself led toward water with vanishing shores, seize your freedom by any means necessary, and cultivate distrust of the color pink. Pink is taken as a color of innocence, the color of childhood. But as it spills across the water in the light of the dying sun, do not fall into its pretty path. There, right underneath, lies a bottomless graveyard of children, mothers, and men. I shudder to imagine all the Africans rocking in the deep. Every time I've sailed the seas, I have the sense of gliding over the unburied. Some people call the sunset a creation of extraordinary beauty and proof of God's existence. But what benevolent force would bewitch the human spirit by choosing pink to light the path of a slave vessel? Do not be fooled by that pretty color, and do not submit to its beckoning. Once I've met with a king and told my story, I desire to be interred right here in the soil of London. Africa is my homeland, but I've weathered enough migrations for 5 lifetimes, thank you very much, and I don't care to be moved again.
Okay, that passage not only paints a picture but raises many, many questions for the reader. It's a very it really does make you want to move on. We're going to come right back. We're going to stop for a minute, take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue our discussion.
Great.
On Monday, November 12th at 6:30 p.m., the Center for Black Literature and the School of Business and Professional Administration at Medgar Evers College present an author reading with Lawrence Hill, author of Someone Knows My Name, the compelling story of a young woman's journey from Africa through the Middle Passage, South Carolina, Nova Scotia, and England. This novel will stir your emotions and provide you with a detailed history of slavery in the 1700s. It will take place at Medgar Evers College, 1637 Bedford Avenue, room S122. That's 1637 Bedford Avenue, room S122. For more information, call 718-270-6976. That's 718-270-6976. Okay, we are back in the studios of Medgar Evers College. This is Writers on Writing, and I'm your host, Brenda Greene. We are talking today on the telephone with Lawrence Hill, the author of Someone Knows My Name. And again, Lawrence, you just read us the opening passage from Someone Knows My Name, which, as I said, raises many questions and gives us foreshadows the story of Someone Knows My Name, the story of Aminata Diallo. Okay. What is the research process that you went through in writing this novel? Because I had to remind myself as I was reading it that it was a novel and not actually a historical document, because there was so much of, you really did a good job of really making history alive.
Thank you so much. The process was really quite overwhelming. If I'd known how demanding and taxing it was going to be, I'm not sure I would have set out to write the novel. So it's a good thing it sort of surprised me as I went along by the magnitude of the project. Because my character, Aminata, lives in so many different places. She's born in Mali, this country in West Africa. She's brought to the coast at Sierra Leone. She's shipped across the ocean in the Middle Passage to the Sea Islands of South Carolina. She works in the Sea Islands. She works in Charleston, South Carolina. She gets up to Manhattan to serve the British during the Revolutionary War. She travels to Nova Scotia, Canada, and then she goes back to Africa, going to Sierra Leone with 1,200 other African Americans in 1792, and then finally ends up in London. So in all of these places, I had to understand, how were African Americans and black people living? What were their living circumstances? What were the politics affecting them on a day-to-day basis? What was the fabric of their lives like? And so I had to understand all of these places in that time period, basically from about 1745 or so, when my character is born, to about the early 1800s, when her life is drawing to a close. So I did the usual, and I read a great many scholarly works about different aspects of black history in all of these places in these times. I had to do very specific research as well. My character, Aminata, earned her living partly as a midwife, or as she calls it, as a baby catcher. So I had to learn a fair bit about midwifery at the time, and different herbs and potions that people were using to take care of the ill, and also to take care of pregnant and delivering women. I also had to sort of familiarize myself with ordinary living circumstances affecting African Americans and Africans. And so while I did read many scholarly books and articles, the most helpful of all were the slave narratives, and also the narratives of Europeans who were living in Africa and traveling in Africa and writing about what they were observing in the 18th century. So the most helpful of all the reading I did were the narratives written by people, black and white, men and women, writing about their lives and the fabric of their lives in the 18th century in the United States, or what of course became known as the United States, and in Africa and in Canada.
Okay. And why did you feel compelled to tell this story?
Well, I learned years ago, before I wrote my first book, which was 15 years ago, that in 1792, these 1,200 African Americans had sailed from Halifax to Freetown, making it the first time in the history of the Americas that any large migration of African Americans were traveling to Africa. But not only were they traveling to Africa from Halifax, they were traveling, some of them, back. Some of them had been born in Africa. A good number, actually, had been born in Africa. So that meant that they'd been enslaved, brought over as young people or children or young adults into the Americas, and then found their way back late in life. And that epic back and forth across the ocean in the same lifetime journey is what fueled my desire to write this story. I tried to imagine the life of a woman, an African woman who's caught up in this movement twice across the ocean. What would that life look like? Where was she born? What did her parents look like? How did she come to be ripped from the arms of her parents? And how did she survive, not just physically but emotionally, being enslaved on an indigo plantation in the Sea Islands of South Carolina? And how did she keep going? I gave her my daughter's name, and I tried to love her the way I love my own eldest child, after whom I named this character, in order to try to have the emotional investment necessary to make her live on the page and step off the page.
Right. And also, I imagine, to take on the voice and the role of a woman. So
yes.
Which
Well, it's funny, because women write about men all the time and nobody really bats an eye. But when
yes.
a man writes about a woman, it's news. Maybe because so many of us have done such a terrible job at it that it does feel a bit risky, and it did feel a bit risky. On the other hand, it was also liberating, and I feel that as a writer, one moral imperative is to understand and empathize with and love the people that I write about. Even if they're doing despicable things, I have to think of them as human beings, and I have to try to render them in a human way on the page. And so that applies, of course, to women and men, and I can't limit myself to writing only about my own life experiences. That would be so terribly boring for readers and for me. And so there was an element of intimidation involved. It was a stretch to put myself in the shoes of a woman and have her tell this story. On the other hand, it did feel liberating and exciting.
I like the idea of you saying it being liberating and exciting, as I said, particularly from a male perspective. What are some of the themes that you see coming out of this novel?
Well, I guess one of the themes that captures my imagination most fully is the concept of human courage. We stand on the shoulders of all the people who went before us, not just those in our family, and maybe not even those in our own racial or ethnic group, but all of the human beings that went before us who survived some of the most unspeakable atrocities. And one of the things that fascinates me is that some people not only physically survived these atrocities, and I'm speaking of the Middle Passage and slavery and the ripping of one from one's freedom in Africa and bringing one into chains and slavery in the Americas, but survived emotionally. And how is it that a person such as my protagonist, Aminata, not only physically lasts for several decades, but remains a loving and an engaged person who wants to give to other people, who wants to engage with other people, who wants to help other people, and it doesn't find itself smitten down completely with a very understandable reaction towards hatred or self-abuse or kind of murderous behavior. She wants to love. And how is this? And so I guess one of the themes of the book is the theme of human courage in the face of unspeakable challenges.
Right, and that in and of itself is motivating. If you think about if one thinks about one's own life and the struggles that they go through on an ongoing basis, and then you read something like this, it really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It does, and I also feel I hope that it is an uplifting novel. It tries to be unflinching, and it definitely paints a pretty sad picture of a woman's life in many instances, but it's also a story of redemption and a story of courage and survival, and I hope and believe that a reader will leave the story shaking her or his head and thinking, wow, courage this character must have had to have, and what courage my own ancestors must have had to survive these conditions that are just so hard to imagine.
Right. You, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the use of this novel, for example, in our schools, and how many people hear about the story, but they really don't really know the story, and they don't know this aspect of the story, and how it is important for people in our schools, for our teachers and our students, to hear it, and you provide the telling of the story from a personal perspective, which is one that many people can really relate to.
Well, thank you, and I think it's true. I mean, usually, how do we come to really care about and to relate to things that are long gone, things that are in our past? We relate personally, and we relate to the struggles of human beings, and their struggles become, in our imagination, our struggles, and their struggles uplift us when we think about our own lives. And so I think that dramatizing the personal is always a good way to begin to sort of draw people into another time and place. But I also think that every generation needs to come to terms with the major episodes of its past. I mean, if we're talking about slavery, if we're talking about the Holocaust, if we're talking about the genocide in Rwanda, if we're talking even about the decline of the Roman Empire, if we ask ourselves these questions and try to come to terms with them, it's because every generation strives to figure out what's gone on beforehand and tries to make sense of it in their own terms. So here I am, writing a novel about slavery and liberation and believing that it's still applicable to people today and to young people as well.
You're right, and that, as you said, that speaks to why we need historical novels. Okay, Lawrence, would you also describe for us your writing process? You've written 4 novels.
Yes,
And
well, actually 3 novels and 4 nonfiction books. The writing process is a bit chaotic. My wife and I have 5 children, and it's a busy household, and often we're just running out, taking kids to their various lessons or after-school activities and the like. So I wish I could say that I just wrote all day quietly at the keyboard, but it's a pretty crazy life. Whenever it's possible, I try to write in the morning when I have the most energy and I'm sort of able to spend the most time at it before other things get in the way. The writer Anthony Burgess says that writers these days need to learn to write in conditions of chaos, and I guess I've had to learn to do that myself.
what prompted you to become a writer? And it's interesting, both you and your wife, you said, are full-time writers.
Well, writing for me has been a way of making sense of the world and my relationship to it. My parents were well, my father was an African American and my mother was a white American who married in Washington, D.C. in '53 and then came to live in Canada and to raise us in a suburb of Toronto. And writing, which really began in earnest for me as a young teenager, was a way of making sense of my place in the world and who was I and how did I relate to the world and what was my identity and where did I fit in and where did I belong? And so reading and writing became for me ways of self-discovery. And so it all branched off from there, really.
Okay. And what message would you have for our listeners, our students?
Well, I think it's important to follow your passions in life. I believe that there are a lot of people who are terribly disgruntled and unhappy and dissatisfied and maybe even embittered by the work that they're doing and the things that occupy their time. And if you have something that you're passionate about, that you care about, that really excites you, I would encourage a young person to go at it fully and to try to follow one's passions and not to become a person who's become bitter or angry because he or she hasn't had the opportunity or taken the opportunity to go after the things that are most interesting to that person. So follow your passions and realize that people are likely to put roadblocks in your way, and you need a certain amount of humility in order to learn from people who've got more experience than you, but you also need a healthy dose of arrogance so that when people do knock you down, you just get up and keep on going, because most things in life that are interesting do take a fair bit of persistence and work and won't fall in your lap right away.
Very important to remember. Thank you for those wise words.
Thank you.
Okay, and I want to thank you for sharing your story with us. I want to encourage our listeners to go out and purchase Someone Knows My Name. The author is Lawrence Hill. We've been talking with him and he's from Canada, Canadian writer. This is a historical fiction, one that you will not want to put down. So again, thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Brenda.
Okay, and remember, the writer is always reading. The reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And I want to thank my engineer, Trevor. Come back next week. If you need to reach me, if you want to share your thoughts with me, please write me, Brenda Greene. Write me writers@mec.cuny.edu. That's writers@mec.cuny.edu. Okay, Brenda Greene signing off. Come back next week.
Most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers. And we call this song, I've Known Rivers.